Hypercarry champions in League are among the most difficult to find a healthy win-win situation for in general. The very goal of the class is to unironically literally 1v9 games, further distinguishing them from more traditional carries. One of my favorite videos I ever made on this channel was on hypercarries, and how I believed they're actually one of the worst champions to carry the game with, following up a few months later with a video on anti-carries. Since it's been a while, I wanted to revisit this topic one more time and go more in detail on why balancing them feels almost impossible, demonstrating this via jungle hypercarries in particular, but I will include everyone else in that discussion. I'm sure we're all privy to the dominant narrative that jungle has the highest immediate influence out of any role in the game, not necessarily that it's the easiest to carry. I feel the need to make that disclaimer as I often get comments voicing how difficult the role is to learn. In any case, through recent years, the jungle has also become the most class-diverse role in the game, featuring members of all 7 classes: fighters, mages, marksmen, slayers, controllers, tanks, and specialists. After much effort to increase accessibility for players, there's been a significant increase in carry junglers, whose lack of early survivability has been made up for by the less hazardous environment compared to the early days of seasons 1 through 5. An unfortunate consequence of this is that it has led to a proportional increase in 1v9 champions, new and old. For today, we're going to be analyzing the hypercarry archetype once more, specifically jungle hypercarries, and talk about why there will never be a reality where they're effective and balanced at the same time. First and foremost, the biggest problem with hypercarries is that they need to get fed, and rather than waste their time getting kills, they should get real food with HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal prep catering service that delivers fresh handmade meals right to your door, with over 40 easy recipes to choose from that take anywhere between 15 to 40 minutes to prepare. Time to time I use HelloFresh whenever I feel too lazy to cook, and I know that you guys experience the same feeling too, don't lie. By going on their website, you can look at their menus from week to week and choose which ones you're interested in. Each dish comes with a list of ingredients as well as an estimated time frame for how long they take to make, along with some additional details like if it's spicy, low carb, high protein, vegetarian, and whatnot. Everything comes pre-portioned so you don't have to worry about excess leftovers. For the fall season, they have a lineup of autumn-themed items ranging from desserts like the apple cider cake with caramel sauce, or appetizers like the barbecue pulled pork nachos or the mini pumpkin cheesecake. Best part is that HelloFresh is cheaper than grocery shopping while being 25% less expensive than your average takeout. So if you're looking for a variety of good quality meals at affordable price, then use my code POGVARSOCT16 or use my link on screen for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Great to be working with HelloFresh again, but for now let's go back to talking about hypercarries. Some time ago, I think early 2020, Exile made a fantastic documentary on hypercarry junglers, going in detail on the circumstances that prevent them from being buffed. I highly advise you check that video out after this one if you want some context on how this situation came to be, but for a basic TLDR, there have been multiple attempts to give hypercarry champions the means and wherewithal to achieve their win condition that have all been discarded at this point due to there simply being no healthy solution for them and their opponents. There still isn't. To recap, what separates hypercarries from traditional ones is usually self-sustainability. Marksmen are the textbook definition of carries, with the added condition that they're being supported and protected by their team, meaning they can only carry if their team enables them to, and while that certainly extends to hypercarries as well, they're a bit more solo-oriented. Hypercarries are known for extreme persistent and/or wide-covering damage, having virtually limitless uptime to where the only time they can exert pressure is if they're being hard CC'd or they're dead. To balance that out, they tend to lack a modicum of utility whatsoever. What little they do have is meant to aid them, not the team. Finally, even though hypercarries have a reputation for 1v9 in games, it plays out more like a king of the hill type situation where you take on one person at a time, not really all 5 members of the enemy team at once. These champions are among the most item dependent in the game, often being significantly more vulnerable than most other champions for the first 10 to 20 minutes of the game, mandating that the person playing the hypercarry do their best to hold the line and not bleed out too much to where they're simply too far behind to make up that difference in the mid to late game. Likewise, their teammates have to be aware that they're at a serious disadvantage and pressure in the early game, and should play more conservatively with that in mind. Such conditions are why top and jungle have the highest density of hypercarry champions. Up and top lane, the remote nature of the role lowers the probability of external intervention for and against them. If you get lucky, you might be able to pick a hypercarry into a favorable matchup, giving you a more comfortable early game experience. For example, if the enemy team blind picks Mundo, Mordekaiser, Garen, Cassante, or anyone who has a hard time getting up close and personal really fast, it's basically a free lane for Kale. Cassiopeia is sometimes played top for the same idea. On rare occasions, you might encounter a Vayne top as well. Tryndamere is constantly abused top whenever he's even the slightest bit strong. Another reason top lane is a hotbed for hypercarries is because of the disproportionately higher experience gain up there. Doubtless you've had games where bot lane's level 11 while your top laner is 14 even though you have the same CS numbers. Faster experience gain means faster power spike. Regarding the jungle, it is by far the highest number of 1v9 champions, and the biggest contributing factor to that would have to be the absence of a direct opponent. In practice, you are against an opponent, the enemy jungler, and will most definitely come in contact with them in the early game as you navigate your way around the map. But technically speaking, there's no champion who's in constant presence of you, even predator junglers, which means to some extent you are guaranteed to scale. and it just so happens many Hypercarry junglers are power farmers. You can be up against an unfavorable matchup like Master Yi vs Rek'Sai, but through good jungle tracking and your own movement, you can spend most of the early game avoiding her entirely. It just might come at the expense of your laners flaming you for quote-unquote doing nothing while they're being ganked all over the place. Junglers in particular can also easily create low-risk, high-reward situations to score kills and leads. With the exception of being counter-ganked, you're always at a numbers advantage when you gank. And depending on how good your jungle tracking is, having the element of surprise can make all the difference between killing or being killed, allowing hypercarries a way to punish enemy junglers who are too careless with their health management or map awareness. And the last thing you want is for a Master Yi, Kindred, Karthus, bel'veth, or King to get a free kill in the early game, because then you're really screwed. Now comes the part where we actually talk about the balance issue of hypercarries. Why exactly are they impossible to balance? To start, let me bust out my handy dandy Desmos graphing calculator to show you two charts. Chart number 1 is the scaling of a regular champion as they purchase items, get levels, and progress through a match. Chart number 2 is the scaling of a hypercarry. Now look at both lines put together. For the sake of argument, we can assume the numbers on the x-axis represent champion level. Conceptually, a regular champion outpaces a hypercarry for the early parts of the game, getting more value from their first and second item than the latter's corresponding first and second item. But at a certain point, the hypercarry scaling measurably ramps up to where their third and fourth item would provide as much value as the normal champion's fifth and sixth, putting them infinitely above the normal champion for the remainder of the game. That's not to say a 6-item normal champion like Kha'Zix can't beat a 6-item Yi, but assuming we're building for taking each other on, it will take immaculate play from the Kha'Zix and or terrible play from the Yi for the Kha'Zix to win that. Here's another example, Kassadin vs LeBlanc. Assuming equal player skill, the Kassadin player will outpressure LeBlanc every single time, whether in 1v1s or full-blown teamfights. There is no universe where a 6-item LeBlanc outcarries a 6-item Kassadin, I don't care who you are. But what allows the LeBlanc player a chance to overcome that disparity is the time frame she has before that equilibrium point as demonstrated by the graph I previously brought up. By roughly level 11 is when Kassadin starts to outscale LeBlanc, but prior to that she can put up a reasonable fight against him in lane, and can also have a bigger impact on the map in terms of skirmishes, teamfights, and roams. The question of balancing a hypercarry then becomes, where should that equilibrium point be, and more importantly, how much should be required to reach that point? That brings us to the first stumbling block with balancing hypercarries. For years, nay over a decade, the balance team has tried and failed to find where that inflection point should be. When is it appropriate for a hypercarry to speed past everyone else? Empirically speaking, I don't think there is one, because it fundamentally clashes with the ideal that every champion should have a fair and equal chance to be viable. In other words, you have to choose between two mutually exclusive options. If you try to give a hypercarry champion any amount of legroom to scale up, you're actively taking away from their opponent's time frame to shut them down, and vice versa. Some of you might try to say, okay, then why not just put that point right in the middle? 50-50, that way neither side gets an advantage. It's not that simple. If it were merely a contest of numbers versus numbers, like one Pokemon versus another Pokemon and it's just them versus you, then it would be much easier to gauge which one is superior to another at what time and how can they balance each other out. But League is of course more complicated than that. Items, runes, team compositions, dragons, lanes, roles, so many things that can throw a wrench into all of that. Going back into jungle for a moment, like I said before, the reason there are so many hypercarries in jungle is due to the absence of a constant opponent. Yes, Rek'Sai might be a huge threat to mastery in the early game, but unlike top, mid, and bot lane, you're not always going to be staring her right in the face, placing the onus on Rek'Sai to go out of her way to hunt down Yi and put him in the dirt. But he has his own jungle, you have yours. He can go from camp to camp without ever coming in contact with you and can actively scale no matter what you try to do. Even if you do a great job ganking lanes, or taking your dragon, or herald, it doesn't slow down the Master Yi. In bot lane for instance, Vayne is a beast late game, the original hypercarry. She will easily outdamage most other marksmen, but this is offset by her poor wave clear and subpar neutral game, making it easier for Dravens, Lucians, Zyras, and Zerats to bully her out of farm, thus slowing down her rate of scaling which buys them more time. It's much more difficult to bully the enemy jungler. If the E player is resolute on power farming, there's nothing you can really do about it unless you're invading him 24/7, but that in and of itself is a huge risk for you since it leaves you vulnerable to being collapsed on, not to mention you're neglecting your own camps. So unless you successfully kill him every time you see him, it's a net loss for you. And remember, unlike other matchups where 3,000 to 4,000 gold lead for your team is adequate enough of a lead to maintain for the rest of the game, provided you don't throw or get outsmited at Baron, against hypercarries you need a 6,000 to 7,000 gold lead for the same effect. 3 to 4 isn't a safe enough margin for error against a hypercarry. By the way, this applies to every hypercarry jungler, I'm just using Yi for this example. Karthus, Kindred, bel'veth, Kayn, Graves, maybe Lilia, all of them could do the same thing. There's a similar dynamic for this in top and by extension mid lane as well. Take Renekton vs Tryndamere. In typical early game lane bully fashion, Renekton shits on Tryndamere. But to ensure Tryndamere stays behind, Renekton has to devote the entire rest of the game matching him in side lane, which is a huge waste of time. So it's in the Renekton player's best interest to roam and get stuff done elsewhere, but in doing so, he gives Tryndamere a free lane to power farm and catch up. That's the second issue with hypercarries. They're always a problem. There's kind of a misconception of hypercarries being feast or famine champions. If you put them behind early, they're useless, which is true to an extent. However, because of their parabolic scaling, they're guaranteed to turn into a problem. It just depends on how long it takes. Against Akali, if you beat her in lane, you can rest assured she's not going to magically turn into Jesus and whoop your entire team's ass. Sure, the squishy champions might still have to keep an eye out for her, but she's not going to 1v9 pentakill your team. But even if you manage to push down a Kale early on, if you take too long to end the game or she scores a shutdown or two, she can and will destroy you. Against hypercarries, you don't have to push them down once, you have to keep pushing them down since all it takes is one mistake in the mid game for them to pull a 180. In a sense, they're like time bombs, only no matter how many times you disarm them, they can still explode. Circling back around to the idea of fair opportunity to be viable and fair opportunity to shut them down, the reason hypercarry champions, especially junglers, will never find themselves in a state of fairness is because the goalpost keeps moving. In Exil's video, he mostly talked about I believe seasons 4 through 6 back when we had Pharaoh Flare and Zeta Devour. League was a lot slower in tempo back then, giving hypercarries plenty of time and subsequently a generous margin for error to scale into the mid to late game when snowballing wasn't as crazy, which meant they had to be relatively weaker than the rest of the competition to make up for that. In the present day, games are much faster, early mistakes are more consequential, and so the gap between hypercarries and normal champs was narrowed a lot. But that raises concerns over the possibility of them beginning their 1v9 conquest off even the slightest concession. These days, it hardly feels like these hypercarries are weak at all. bel'veth is one of the most notorious predator junglers with amazing dueling potential early game. Granted, she's one of the newer champions, but even Kindred, they used to be ass until 3 items, now you see them 3 buffing every game. Mastery with Hail of Blades is a very terrifying sight, and it feels like all he needs is Blade of the Ruined King and boots to start pentakilling everyone. Having talked about King just recently in his Why Everyone Plays episode, they made him go from non-existent at base to surprisingly formidable. Lane hypercarries also no longer feel like they have an actual weak early game. Tryndamere consistently averages a gold advantage of over like 95% of top laners by 10 minutes, whereas 8 years ago, he couldn't do anything until 2 items. Khaled used to be irrelevant until level 16, but after successive buffs, it almost feels like his 1v9 mode activates at rank 2 ultimate instead of rank 3. Some might argue Vayne's more of a mid-game champion now, not a late game. With how explosive and volatile the game is, there essentially is no equilibrium point anymore. Hypercarries are just as strong as normal carries with the added privilege of scaling like a motherfucker. To be clear, I'm not saying a Kale can 1v1 a Darius pre-6 in laning phase, or that Cassiopeia has no losing matchups, but there isn't as big of a disparity anymore, which is why these champions are repeatedly buffed, nerfed, buffed again, and then nerfed again, with the gap in strength being the closest it's ever been. Tiny changes, whether internal or external, can make all the difference between hypercarries being a 46% win rate or 54%, forcing the balance team to never stop making small adjustments. You guys remember a few weeks back in version 13.17 when they bumped up Tryndamere's attack range to 175 from 125 and lowered his base AD from 72 to 68? This was originally intended to be an adjustment to make him feel more intuitive to play while at the same time not trying to push his win rate. Lo and behold, Tryndamere went from like a 49% win rate to almost 53%. On the flip side, in 13.16, Kindred was chilling at a 52.5% win rate in Diamond Plus, very high for a supposed hypercarry jungler. So they tried to push their power back a tiny bit by cutting Mounting Dread's efficiency, only for that to knock them down a full 3% in win rate. Not saying these buffs and nerfs were not significant. Increasing the attack range of a melee champion whose entire MO is auto-attacking is a big deal. Conversely, decreasing the advantage state of a jungler hurts them in many ways, ganking and invading to name a few. But it's the hyper-snowballing nature of the game that causes such drastic swings in performance, especially on hypercarries. It is a never-ending battle of correction. No matter how hard they try, hypercarries will always be in a position where they're too forgiving to play or too unforgiving to play. There's no middle ground, and there never will be since one actively plays against the other. I'm not implying that hypercarries are the most problematic champions in the game either, but it's a good illustration of what happens when you give a champion too much carry potential. It's a lot easier to balance a tank than a carry, let's just put it that way. Anyways, that's gonna be it for today. Let me know your thoughts on balancing hypercarries in the comments down below, particularly if you agree or disagree with my opinion that hypercarries can never be balanced. As always though, if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and be sure to check out Exil's video on farming junglers as well as my other video on hypercarries if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.